Hello and welcome to our online video. The purpose of this particular economics video is to introduce students to the economic rationale reasoning principles behind international trade. We're going to be discussing the terms absolute advantage, comparative advantage. Comparative advantage has tied to it the idea of cost, comparative opportunity costs, specialization in trade, and terms of trade. Absolute advantage is the easiest of these principles to explain. It simply means that a country has the ability to produce more of any good than its potential trading partner. So in absolute numbers, in the quantity department, the country can produce more than its potential trading partner. Comparative advantage has to do with the idea of opportunity cost. If you remember our study of the production possibilities model, we were able to calculate the opportunity cost involved with trade-offs because of the limitations of production. In other words, every time a nation wanted more of good X, they had to give up a certain number of good Y. Comparative advantage is linked directly to this economic principle of opportunity cost, and it states that a country, a nation, an economy has a comparative advantage in producing a product or a good if they can produce that product or good at a lower domestic opportunity cost than its potential trading partner. So for instance, if you look at the possibility of trade between, say, the United States and Mexico, and you're looking at a product such as avocados, even though the United States may be able to produce more avocados in absolute terms, the domestic opportunity cost of producing an avocado in Mexico is likely to be lower than the United States. And if a country has a lower domestic opportunity cost in producing a product, it therefore has a comparative advantage. This is an important principle because comparative advantage is the economic rationale behind specialization. This final note on comparative advantage is extremely important. Although it is quite possible and actually likely for one nation to have an absolute advantage, that is to say in pure numbers, an absolute advantage in producing two products, it is a mathematical statistical impossibility for a country to have a comparative advantage in producing both products. David Ricardo was the economist who proved this, and his contributions to international economics and the idea of comparative advantage as the rationale behind specialization in trade are the reason why most economists believe that specialization makes all potential trading partners better off. We will look at a few examples to prove this important note on comparative advantage. Now that we have some basic background information regarding the international economic tools of absolute advantage and comparative advantage, let's use some graphical analysis to investigate the principles of international trade, specialization, and gains from trade. First, a quick review of the principles associated with the production possibilities frontier. Remember, the production possibilities model is used as an economic tool to explain, first, in the short run or for a specific amount of time, the absolute limitations of production. Second, the idea that there's always trade-offs and costs involved. In other words, you can't have more of good X without giving up some of good Y. The third economic idea associated with the production possibilities model is economic efficiency. And finally, the possibility of economic growth. So here we have the production possibility frontier for a small nation called the Crew. On the vertical axis, we have their potential production of huts. On the horizontal axis, we have their potential production of radios. We will assume that their production possibility frontier represents the possible production for 1 month. So the first thing you should notice is the production possibility frontier is linear. It is a straight line. Why is that important? It demonstrates what we call constant costs along the curve. Remember, the production possibility frontier itself, the line, represents this nation, the crew, their absolute limitations of production. The line also demonstrates the trade-off in costs. In other words, every time the crew wants another hut, they have to give up a radio. Every time they give up a radio, every time they want a radio, they have to give up a hut. So every time they want a hut, they have to give up a radio. Every time they want a radio, they give up a hut. What is the cost involved with those choices? Because the production possibility frontier is linear, it's going to be constant cost along the curve. So every time the crew wants an additional hut, they have to give up the exact same number of radios all along the entire curve. This is different than the macro examples we studied earlier, and it is an assumption that economists make when introducing the principles of international trade. Now that we understand that the crew's production possibility frontier is linear and demonstrates constant cost along the curve, how do you calculate the opportunity cost of each product in question? Well, if the crew just made huts, they could make in 1 month 120. You see, that's their maximum level of production on the vertical axis. Likewise, if the crew just made radios, they can make 20. Notice that the production possibility frontier on the horizontal axis stops just short of 21. Therefore, their maximum possible level of production for radios is 20. If the crew never considers specialization in trade, they will produce some combination of huts and radios and therefore pick one point along their curve, which represents the mix or the allocatively efficient point, the combination of output which maximizes their happiness or satisfaction. Remember, that's a normative decision. But to calculate opportunity cost, one simply takes potential radio production, 20, put that on your denominator, against potential hut production, 120, put that on your numerator. 120 over 20 equals 6. So 120 divided by 20, therefore, the opportunity cost of a radio is 6 huts. That is to say, every time the crew wants a radio, they have to give up exactly 6 huts. To figure out the opportunity cost of a hut, you simply invert the fraction, 20 over 120, and the opportunity cost of a hut is 1/6 of a radio. These numbers become important because having a lower domestic opportunity cost means that a country has a comparative advantage in producing a specific product. Here we have the exact same scenario for a different nation called the Islanders. This production possibility frontier still represents possible production of huts and radios for this country for 1 month. Notice that their maximum level of hut production is 90. The maximum level of radio production is 10. Their production possibility frontier is still linear, and calculating opportunity cost is done the exact same manner as the previous example. Giving up 90 huts to get 10 radios means that the opportunity cost of a radio is 9 huts, and the opportunity cost of a hut is 1/9 of a radio. Now that we have demonstrated it graphically, let's remind ourselves mathematically why the crew has the comparative advantage of making radios and why the Islanders have the comparative advantage of making huts. Here's the same information from the previous slides superimposed so that it's quickly available for us right now. The opportunity cost of a radio for the crew is 6 huts. That is to say, every time the crew wants a radio, they have to give up 6 huts. For the Islanders, every time they want a radio, they have to give up 9 huts. Remember, lower is better. Having a lower domestic opportunity cost means that a nation possesses the comparative advantage in producing that product. Therefore, the crew has the comparative advantage in producing radios. For the Islanders, every time they want a hut, they have to give up 1/9 of a radio. And for the crew, every time they want a hut, they have to give up 1/6 of a radio. Therefore, the islanders, as we determined just a moment ago, mathematically, statistically have proven that they actually have the comparative advantage in producing huts. So the islanders have a lower domestic opportunity cost of producing huts than the crew, even though they are at an absolute disadvantage in producing both products. So we know 3 things. Number 1, the crew will make radios. Number 2, the islanders will make huts. We determined this based on comparative advantage and the idea of specialization. Therefore, the crew will specialize in producing radios. That is the product in which they have the comparative advantage. How many will they make each month? The crew will now make 20. Why? That is their maximum level of production, their absolute limitations of production. The islanders will make huts and trade for radios. How many will they make? They will make 90. How do we know? Because based on their production possibility frontier, that's their limitations of production. The last thing we know is that the 2 nations will now specialize in producing the product in which they enjoy the comparative advantage and trade for the other product. Therefore, the crew will not make any huts. They'll just make radios and trade for huts. The islanders will not make any radios. They'll just simply make huts and trade for radios. The last part of this puzzle is important. How many huts will the crew receive for each radio? How many radios will the islanders receive for each hut? So each country will produce the product in which it has the comparative advantage, but there's still a question that remains. We know the crew will make radios, the islanders will make huts. How do they come to some arrangement on a situation which is beneficial for both of them? Economists refer to this as the terms of trade. It's a pretty straightforward idea. It's the rate at which goods are exchanged. So it's the amount of good A given up for good B in trade. In our example, the crew will just make radios and they will trade for huts. Every time they send a radio over to the islanders, how many huts will they receive? Likewise, the islanders will just make huts and trade for radios. So every time they send a hut over to the crew, how many radios will they receive? Important idea associated with terms of trade is that the terms of trade have to lie, must lie with somewhere between the respective domestic opportunity cost in production. So for instance, neither country is going to make themselves worse off through trade. Neither country will make themselves worse off through trade. No one would ever voluntarily do that. For the crew, the opportunity cost of a radio was 6 huts. So they're going to want a minimum of 6 huts in return. In other words, the opportunity cost domestically for a radio was 6 huts. Therefore, they're going to want at least a minimum of probably more than 6 huts in return for each radio. Likewise, for the islanders, the opportunity cost of each hut was 1/9 of a radio. They're going to want more than 1/9 of a radio in exchange for each huts. Now, forget radios and huts for a moment. Just understand the economic principle that a country is going to make itself better off through trade, through the terms of trade. In other words, they'll negotiate to the point where they're getting at least somewhat more than the domestic cost was at home. When it is all said and done, why do nations engage in specialization in trade? Remember the last economic principle associated with the production possibilities frontier, and that is the possibility of economic growth. This graph shows you a point outside the curve that says the crew consumes this much. Remember, any point outside the curve represented desirable but unattainable given the limitations of a domestic production possibility frontier. However, through specialization in trade, a nation actually is able to consume at a point beyond its productive possibility frontier domestically. Now, of course, what is good for the crew also benefits the islanders. So the islanders also now get to consume at a point beyond their production possibility frontier. Let's revisit the ideas of absolute advantage, comparative advantage, specialization in trade in this example concerning Belgium and Canada using the graphs. Here we have both the Belgian production possibility frontier and the Canadian production possibility curve graphed on the same exact graph. The black production possibility frontier is the Belgian curve, and the red production possibility curve is the Canadian production possibility frontier. First, we notice that Belgium has the absolute advantage of producing DVDs. In 1 month, Belgium can produce 60, while Canada can only produce 54. Likewise, we notice that Belgium has the absolute advantage of producing tractors, 20 per month versus 10. We already calculated this, but let's explain or revisit it. Belgium has the comparative advantage in making tractors. Why? They have a lower domestic opportunity cost than Canada. The opportunity cost of making a tractor in Belgium is 3 DVDs. The opportunity cost of making a tractor in Canada is 4.5 DVDs. Again, the graph shows this as the Belgian production of tractors seriously outpaces the Canadian potential production of tractors. Therefore, Canada has a comparative advantage in producing DVDs. We know that all we need to do is invert the fractions to come up with the Canadian opportunity cost of making a DVD is 2 over 9 or 0.222 repeating. The opportunity cost of making a DVD in Belgium is 0.3333. Therefore, mathematically, Belgium has the comparative advantage in making DVDs. Finally, we know that based on comparative costs, Belgium will make tractors. They will make 20 per month. Canada will make DVDs. They will make 54 per month. Each country will specialize based on comparative advantage and trade for the other product. The last piece of this economic puzzle is the detail we did not cover in the previous example with the crew and the islanders. Assume that Canada chooses D as in dog on their production possibility frontier as allocatively efficient. Now, that would absolutely positively have to be given to you. In other words, you couldn't look at the possibilities of A, B, C, D, E, F, and G on the production possibility frontier of Canada and just pick one which looks good. Remember, allocative efficiency is the exact mix of output which maximizes the happiness or satisfaction of the citizens within that country. It's a normative decision. It's based on marginal benefits and marginal cost. So we're telling you that the Canadians were happy with a mix of 6 tractors and 27 DVDs per month at point D as in dog on their production possibility frontier. The Belgians were happy at G as in good on their production possibility frontier, a mix of output of 12 tractors and 24 DVDs. The reason we need to know this, it helps us calculate mathematically what are the gains from specialization in trade. Okay, Canada will just make DVDs. Why? They have a comparative advantage making DVDs, a lower domestic opportunity cost. How many will they make? They will make as many as they possibly can. Point A on their production possibility curve, 54. They will trade for tractors. If they make 54 and they liked 27 before at point D, at their allocatively efficient point, that's where the marginal benefits of consuming DVDs equal the marginal cost of the resources necessary to produce those products. That means there are 27 available for trade. 54 produced, 27 available for trade. If you look at Belgium's allocatively efficient point prior to trade, which was G as in good, Belgium was only producing and consuming 27. Therefore, there is a gain of 3 DVDs. 54 produced by Canada, 27 kept by Canada. Now Belgium has 27 as opposed to 24, an increase of 3 DVDs. The exercise is similar for tractors. Belgium will just make tractors because they have a lower domestic opportunity cost. They have the comparative advantage of making tractors. How many will they make? They will make 20 at point K on their curve. They will trade for DVDs. Belgium produces 20, but they are happy at G as in good on their curve, which means if they make 20, they want to keep 12. 20 produced, 12 kept at home means 8 available for trade. If you look at Canada, prior to engaging in specialization in trade, Canada was only producing and consuming 6 tractors at point D on their curve. Therefore, there's an increase in production of 2 tractors. So the gains from trade are 3 DVDs and 2 tractors. Now remember, this is an introductory class which provides a simplistic economic rationale for specialization trade and the gains from trade. In class, we will discuss some of the details involved with the particulars of who wins, who loses, and why nations sometimes erect barriers to trade.